When a celebrated linguistics professor mocks a maid's daughter in class, he unknowingly challenges a prodigy fluent in 9 languages, one who's about to rewrite everything. Just write something, anything, in Japanese, he said, smiling that smile people use when they think they're untouchable. What happened next would silence one of the most powerful voices in academia. In a room built for brilliance, a girl no one was supposed to notice picked up a single piece of chalk. 14 years old. The maid's daughter. The wrong person in the wrong place, until she wasn't. No one in that hall could have imagined that a few strokes on a blackboard would rewrite reputations, expose arrogance, and awaken something buried deep in the heart of language itself. Words are power, her grandfather used to tell her, but only if you know when not to use them. This isn't just a story about a girl who could write. It's a story of how silence spoke louder than genius and changed everything. And before I forget, where are you watching from today? Leave a comment below. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Enjoy the story. A single piece of chalk held the power to silence a room full of scholars. This morning, that power belonged to a 14-year-old girl who was not supposed to be there. And she was about to remake the world in her own image, one language at a time. The air in the Atherton auditorium was old and quiet, thick with the scent of aged paper, floor polish, and the faint, metallic tang of ambition. Sunlight, sliced thin by the tall, arched windows, fell across rows of dark oak seats, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stillness. On the stage, a man stood as if he were carved from the same wood as the podium before him. This was Professor Wallace Thorne, a man whose reputation for brilliance was exceeded only by his reputation for arrogance. His silver hair was perfectly combed. His tweed jacket was perfectly tailored. His lecture on the subtle complexities of Japanese syntax was, in his own mind, perfectly delivered. He spoke to a captive audience of linguistics students, their faces a mix of earnest concentration and quiet reverence. They scribbled notes furiously, trying to capture the pearls of wisdom that fell from his lips. Professor Thorne enjoyed this. He saw himself not as a teacher, but as a gatekeeper of knowledge, and he guarded his gate with a fierce and petty pride. In the back of the grand hall, near the heavy double doors, 2 figures stood in the shadows, their presence a quiet counterpoint to the professor's booming voice. Helen carried a silver tray with a porcelain teapot and cups for the faculty members seated in the front row. Her movements were practiced and efficient, designed to be unnoticed. She was a woman who had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of invisibility. At her side, her daughter, Abigail, held her mother's worn handbag. Abigail was 14. Her blonde hair, a simple braid down her back, seemed to capture what little light reached the back of the auditorium. She was slight of frame, dressed in a plain blue dress that had been washed so many times it had softened to the color of a twilight sky. She did not look at the professor. Her eyes moved over the room, taking in the architecture, the vaulted ceiling, the faces of the students. She was not intimidated by the grandeur of the place. She was simply an observer, cataloging details with a stillness that was unusual for a girl her age. Her mother had told her to wait by the door. "It will only be a moment, Abby," she had whispered in the hallway, her voice warm but tired. "I'll just serve the tea, and we can go." But a faculty assistant had insisted they bring the service directly inside during a brief pause. And so, they found themselves on the edge of Professor Thorne's world, a world that was not meant for them. Professor Thorne paused his lecture, taking a sip of water. His eyes scanned the room, and for the first time, they landed on the 2 figures in the back. He saw Helen, the maid, with her tray. Then his gaze shifted to the young girl beside her. He saw the plain dress, the simple braid, the way she stood quietly, holding a handbag. A small, cruel smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was an opportunity too perfect to resist. A little performance to liven up the dry subject matter. The mid-lecture refreshment," he announced, his voice dripping with condescension. "A welcome tradition." Helen moved forward silently, her eyes downcast. She began to place the cups and saucers on the small table reserved for the faculty. Abigail remained by the door, waiting patiently. "And who is this?" Professor Thorne asked, his voice echoing slightly in the large room. He pointed a long, manicured finger toward Abigail. "A new student, perhaps, eager to begin her scholarly journey." A few nervous titters rippled through the first few rows of students. They knew the professor's moods. They recognized the predatory glint in his eye. Helen paused, her hand hovering over a teacup. "This is my daughter, Abigail, sir," she said softly, not looking up. "She is just waiting for me." "Your daughter," Thorne repeated, savoring the words. He looked from the mother, in her simple uniform, to the girl, in her faded dress. How wonderful. An early introduction to the hallowed halls of academia. He turned back to his audience. "As we were discussing," he continued, "the Japanese language is not merely a collection of words. It is an art form. The elegance of a single kanji character can convey a world of meaning. It requires discipline. It requires a lifetime of study." He then turned his gaze back to Abigail, his smile widening. Perhaps the young lady would like to participate in a small demonstration. Helen froze. A knot of dread tightened in her stomach. "Sir, please," she murmured. "We don't want to interrupt." "Nonsense," Thorne boomed, waving a dismissive hand. "It is no interruption. It is a teaching moment." He beckoned to Abigail. "Come now, child. Don't be shy." Abigail looked at her mother. Helen gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Don't," her eyes pleaded. "Just stay quiet." But Professor Thorne was relentless. "Come up to the board," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for refusal. "I'm sure you've seen Japanese writing in cartoons or on television. Just draw for us what you think a Japanese word looks like. Anything at all. It will be a charming little diversion for the class." The chuckles in the audience grew louder. The students saw what the professor intended, a moment of light comedy at the expense of the maid's daughter. A harmless bit of fun to illustrate his point about the difficulty of the language. They saw a shy, out-of-place girl who would likely draw a clumsy approximation of a character, proving the professor's point about its complexity. Abigail felt her mother's fear. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. She felt the professor's smug certainty. He saw a prop, not a person. He saw a simple girl from a simple background, someone he could use to amuse his students and inflate his own ego. He did not see the truth. He did not see the years of quiet study, the countless hours spent with a kind old man whose hands, though wrinkled, could still guide a pen with perfect grace. He did not hear the echo of a gentle voice explaining the difference between onyomi and kuinyomi readings. He did not see the library of knowledge that lived behind her calm blue eyes. Slowly, deliberately, Abigail handed her mother's bag to Helen. She took a quiet breath, the way her grandfather had taught her to do before tackling a difficult problem. Then, she walked out of the shadows and toward the stage. The auditorium fell silent. The students leaned forward, a sense of anticipation in the air. This was going to be either deeply embarrassing or unexpectedly entertaining. Abigail stepped onto the stage. It was larger than it looked from the back. The lights were brighter. She could see every face in the first 10 rows. She walked to the massive chalkboard that covered the entire back wall. It was filled with Professor Thorne's neat, academic script. He had left a small, clean space on the right-hand side. She picked up a fresh piece of chalk. It was cool and smooth in her hand. She could feel its powdery texture. For a moment, she stood with her back to the audience, facing the board. The silence stretched. "Any time you're ready, dear," Professor Thorne said, his voice laced with mock encouragement. Abigail closed her eyes for a second. She did not picture the laughing faces or the arrogant professor. She pictured her grandfather's study, the smell of ink and old books. She pictured his smiling eyes. "Show them what words can do, Abby girl," he used to say. "Show them that a humble pen can be mightier than a king's sword." She turned to the board. Her hand did not shake. With a single, fluid motion, she began to write. The first character was tall and elegant. The chalk whispered against the slate. It was a sound that seemed to fill the entire auditorium. The character was perfect. Not the clumsy scrawl of a novice, but the balanced, confident stroke of a master calligrapher. The radicals were perfectly proportioned. The lines had weight and grace. Professor Thorne's smile faltered. His eyebrows drew together in a faint line of confusion. That was surprisingly accurate. A lucky guess, perhaps. But Abigail did not stop. She continued, her movements economical and precise. Next to the first character, she drew another, and then a third, and a final one. And it was there. A quiet heart is a treasure. She did not write in the blocky, printed style of a textbook. She wrote in a semi-cursive script, with a flow and an artistry that spoke of deep familiarity. When she was finished, She placed the chalk back in the tray. She did not look at the professor. She simply stood by the board, her work complete. A ripple of murmurs went through the room. A student in the front row, a graduate student who had spent 2 summers studying in Kyoto, whispered to his neighbor, "My God, that's not just writing. That's Shoto. That's art." Professor Thorne stared at the board. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The phrase was a simple proverb, but the execution was flawless. He had seen professional calligraphers with less skill. He cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control of the situation. "Well," he began, his voice a little tight. "A very neat presentation. Clearly you have an artistic flair. A good copy of something you have seen, no doubt." He tried to dismiss it, to frame it as mimicry rather than knowledge. But Abigail still did not look at him. She picked up the chalk again. The students fell silent once more, watching her. Professor Thorne opened his mouth to tell her that the demonstration was over, but he was too late. Abigail moved to a new spot on the board. This time, her hand moved differently. The characters that appeared were more complex, a dense block of text. They were not Japanese. They were Chinese. Traditional Hanzi. She wrote a famous line from the Tao Te Ching: "The greatest sound is silence. The greatest form has no shape." The meaning was not lost on the graduate students. It was a direct, philosophical rebuke. A quiet girl, a formless presence in the back of the room, was creating something profound. Professor Thorne was now visibly stunned. The condescending smile was gone, replaced by a mask of disbelief. Japanese and Chinese shared many characters, but the stylistic conventions and grammatical context were different. To write both, with such confidence, was not the work of a hobbyist. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice losing its smooth, authoritative edge. Abigail finished the line and, without pausing, moved again. This time, she began to write in the clean, elegant circles and lines of Korean Hangul. The script was completely different, a phonetic alphabet of stunning simplicity and beauty. She wrote a single sentence: "The truth speaks loudest in silence." By now, the auditorium was so quiet you could hear the gentle hum of the overhead lights. The students were no longer watching the professor. All eyes were on the small girl with the blonde braid, who stood before the giant chalkboard as if she owned it. Her plain blue dress seemed less like a sign of poverty and more like the simple robe of a scholar. In the front row, an older woman, Dr. Eleanor Richmond, the head of the comparative philology department, slowly took off her glasses and polished them. She had watched the entire exchange with growing unease, and now, with dawning wonder. She recognized the Korean phrase. She recognized the Chinese proverb. She saw the artistry in the Japanese calligraphy. She was witnessing something impossible. Professor Thorne was pale. He felt the control of his classroom, his sanctum, slipping away. He felt the weight of his own arrogance settling on him like a shroud. "That's enough," he snapped, taking a step toward the stage. "The demonstration is over. Return to your mother, girl." His voice was sharp, but it lacked conviction. It was the bluster of a man who had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered. Abigail heard him, but she did not stop. It was as if she were in a world of her own, a world made of words and meaning. She moved to the last remaining clean space on the board. Her hand began to move in a sweeping, cursive motion from right to left. The beautiful, flowing script of Arabic began to appear on the board. A collective gasp went through the room. This was not a related language family. This was not something one picked up casually. The intricate dots and swooping lines were utterly foreign to most of the students. But to the few who knew, it was a display of breathtaking skill. She wrote a line from the poet Rumi: "Be silent. The silence holds all the answers." The 4 phrases, in 4 different languages, in 4 different scripts, now covered the board. They were not random. They were a conversation. They were a statement. Each one spoke of silence, of quietness, of hidden truths. Together, they formed a powerful, silent symphony that echoed through the stunned auditorium. Abigail finally set the chalk down. The sound was like a gavel striking wood. She turned away from the board and faced the audience. Her face was calm. Her blue eyes were clear. She looked at Professor Thorne, who stood frozen halfway between his podium and the stage. Then she looked past him, to the back of the room, where her mother stood, tears streaming silently down her face. Helen was no longer trying to be invisible. She stood tall, her hand pressed to her heart, looking at her daughter with a fierce, boundless pride that was the loudest thing in the room. The silence held for a long, stretched moment. It was no longer the polite silence of a lecture hall. It was the heavy, ringing silence of astonishment. Then, Dr. Richmond stood up. Her expression was one of pure, unadulterated awe. She began to clap. Not polite applause, but a slow, steady, deliberate clap of respect. One by one, the students joined her. The sound grew, filling the old hall, washing over the stage. It was a sound of wonder, a sound of apology, a sound of victory. It was the sound of a world being turned upside down by a 14-year-old girl with a piece of chalk. Professor Thorne stood alone in the rising tide of applause, his face a mixture of shame and fury. He had tried to make an example of the maid's daughter, and he had succeeded. The applause eventually subsided, leaving a charged silence in its wake. The students remained standing, their eyes fixed on Abigail, who now stood quietly at the side of the stage. She seemed small again, dwarfed by the grand podium and the enormous chalkboard covered in her elegant, multilingual declarations. But no one saw her as small anymore. Professor Thorne, looking utterly deflated, retreated to his podium as if seeking refuge. He shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, but no words came. The authority he had commanded just minutes before had evaporated, leaving only a hollow shell of a man in a well-tailored jacket. It was Dr. Richmond who took control. She walked calmly to the front of the auditorium and stood at the base of the stage, looking up at Abigail. Her voice was gentle, devoid of any of the condescension Abigail had just endured. It was the voice of a true scholar, filled with genuine curiosity. "Young lady," she began, her words clear and carrying. "My name is Dr. Eleanor Richmond. May I ask your name again?" "Abigail," she replied. Her voice was soft, but it did not tremble. "Abigail," Dr. Richmond repeated, a warm smile gracing her lips. "That was an extraordinary display. Truly extraordinary. The proverbs you chose, they were not just random phrases. They were connected. A meditation on the power of silence." She paused, her eyes scanning the 4 distinct scripts on the board. "Where did you learn to do this?" Before Abigail could answer, Professor Thorne found his voice, a last, desperate attempt to salvage his dignity. "It's a parlor trick," he spat, his voice tight with anger. "She's memorized a few phrases. A clever monkey can be taught to copy shapes. It means nothing." The students shifted uncomfortably. The accusation was ugly and sour, and no one believed it. The flawless execution, the thematic link between the proverbs, the sheer mastery of 4 wildly different writing systems. It was far beyond simple mimicry. Abigail met Professor Thorne's furious gaze. For the first time, a flicker of something other than calm appeared in her eyes. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, weary sadness. She looked at him, a man who had dedicated his life to the study of words, and saw only a man who had completely missed their meaning. She turned her attention back to Dr. Richmond. "My grandfather taught me," she said simply. "Your grandfather?" Dr. Richmond prompted, her interest piqued. "Was he a calligrapher? A linguist?" A small, sad smile touched Abigail's lips. "He was many things," she said. "He was a soldier. And then he was a librarian. But mostly he was my teacher." From the back of the room, Helen began to walk forward. She moved slowly down the central aisle, her earlier hesitation gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. She had to be near her daughter. She walked past the rows of stunned students, her gaze locked on Abigail. "Her grandfather was Sergeant Michael Callahan," Helen said, her voice trembling slightly, but filled with an undeniable pride. The name meant nothing to the students, but Dr. Richmond's eyes widened in recognition. "Michael Callahan?" she breathed, a hand going to her throat. "The ghost of Gyeonggi." A few of the older faculty members in the front row began to whisper amongst themselves. The name was not widely known to the public, but in certain academic and military circles, it was the stuff of legend. Michael Callahan was a cryptographer and a forward reconnaissance linguist during the Korean War. He was a man who could slip behind enemy lines armed with little more than his knowledge of half a dozen languages and dialects. He had intercepted communications, translated captured documents under fire, and negotiated with local informants in their own tongue. His work had saved hundreds of lives, but it had all been classified, his name buried in sealed government files for decades. He was a quiet hero from a forgotten part of a forgotten war. He passed away 2 years ago. Helen continued, reaching the stage and taking her daughter's hand. He raised Abby after her father left. He didn't have much money, but he had books, hundreds of them, in every language you can imagine. Abigail squeezed her mother's hand. She looked at the sea of faces before her, and for the first time, she decided to let them see. Not just the writing, but the reason for it. He didn't teach me just to write, Abigail explained, her voice gaining strength. He taught me to listen. He said that every language is a different room in the same house. To understand people, you have to be willing to walk into their room and sit with them for a while. She took a step forward, her eyes scanning the board. He started with Japanese. He learned it from a fellow soldier who was Nisei from California. He told me that beauty can be found even in the darkest of times. The kanji for a quiet heart is a treasure. He learned that in a prisoner of war camp. The mood in the room shifted from awe to a deep, profound respect. This was no longer an academic curiosity. It was a story of survival, of history, of a legacy being passed down through generations. The Chinese, she continued, pointing to the elegant characters. He learned from scrolls he helped recover from a monastery that had been bombed. He said the monks taught him that the most important things are often unseen. She gestured to the Korean Hangul. He loved Korean. He said it was the most logical and beautiful alphabet ever created. He learned it from the villagers who hid him when he was wounded. He said they shared their food with him when they had nothing, and they taught him that truth doesn't need a loud voice to be heard. Finally, her gaze rested on the flowing Arabic script. This one was different. He didn't learn this in a war. He learned it much later in his life, from a doctor who treated him at the Veterans Hospital. Dr. Ahmed was from Syria. They would spend hours talking, sharing stories. My grandfather said Dr. Ahmed taught him that true wisdom begins with listening. She had laid bare the soul of her knowledge. It wasn't a party trick. It was a testament. It was her grandfather's entire life, written in chalk on a blackboard. Professor Thorne stood by his podium, utterly defeated. His world of academic theory, of syntax and semantics, had been washed away by a tide of real human experience. His lecture had been about the purity of a language, about guarding it from outside influence. And here was a child showing that languages were not fortresses to be defended, but bridges to be crossed. They were messy, beautiful, and deeply human. But 4 languages, Dr. Richmond said, her voice still filled with wonder. To have such mastery at your age? Abigail looked down for a moment. There are more, she said quietly. He taught me 9. If the room had been silent before, it was now utterly breathless. 9 languages. He said that after the war, the world felt broken. Abigail's voice was soft, almost a whisper. He thought that if people could just understand each other, if they could just speak each other's words, maybe they wouldn't be so quick to hurt each other. He wanted me to help put a little piece of the world back together. She then did something no one expected. She looked directly at Professor Thorne, her expression not one of triumph, but of empathy. He also taught me that sometimes the most educated people have the most to learn, especially about kindness. The words were not an attack. They were a simple, devastatingly accurate observation. They landed with more force than any insult could have. Professor Thorne visibly flinched. He looked at the girl, at the board, at the faces of his students, and he saw himself reflected in their eyes. A small, petty man, exposed and shamed by the profound wisdom of a child. He opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to offer one last defense, but no sound emerged. He simply deflated, gathering his lecture notes with trembling hands, a man utterly undone. Dr. Richmond stepped forward, her eyes shining. Abigail Callahan, she said, her voice ringing with purpose. Westwood University has a program for gifted young scholars. It has never before been offered to someone your age. But I believe exceptions can and must be made. She held out a hand. I would be honored if you would allow me to introduce you to the dean. We have much to discuss. It was an offer of a new life, a key to a door that Abigail and her mother had never even dared to approach. Helen looked at her daughter, her heart swelling with a love and pride so immense it felt as if it might burst. All those years of struggle, of working 2 jobs, of worrying about their future, it had all led to this moment. Her daughter, her brilliant, quiet daughter, had not just stood up to a bully. She had rewritten their entire future. Abigail looked at Dr. Richmond's outstretched hand. Then she looked at the faces of the students, who were now gazing at her with open admiration. She looked at the arrogant professor, now a diminished figure, and finally at the board, at her grandfather's legacy written in fleeting dust. She had come into the auditorium that morning as the maid's daughter, invisible and silent. She would walk out as Abigail Callahan, the girl who spoke in 9 languages, the girl who carried the wisdom of a quiet hero. She took Dr. Richmond's hand, and as she did, she felt the morning sun, now higher in the sky, fall warmly upon her face. The single, extraordinary morning was not over yet. A new chapter was just beginning. Abigail, her mother, and Dr. Richmond began to walk toward the exit, leaving Professor Thorne alone on his stage, a silent teacher in a room that had suddenly become his classroom. As they walked up the aisle, the students parted for them, creating a path. The whispers that followed were no longer filled with mockery, but with a hushed reverence. Did you see her hands? Not a single tremor. 9 languages. I can barely handle my French minor. That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen in a lecture hall. Professor Thorne watched them go, his knuckles white where he gripped the podium. His mind was a maelstrom of humiliation and disbelief. He had spent his entire career cultivating an aura of untouchable intellect. He had published papers, chaired committees, and sneered at the lesser minds he was forced to endure. And in less than 10 minutes, his entire world had been dismantled by a child with a piece of chalk. He stared at the board, at the phrases that condemned him. A quiet heart is a treasure. The greatest form has no shape. The truth speaks loudest in silence. Be silent. The silence holds all the answers. It wasn't just a linguistic demonstration, it was a narrative. A story told in 4 acts, and he was the villain. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Professor Jenkins, a dry-witted historian who had been sitting in the front row. Jenkins was looking at the board with an unreadable expression. Remarkable, Jenkins said, his voice quiet. I haven't seen you this speechless since the provost rejected your paper on split infinitives. Thorne shot him a venomous glare. It was a trick, Robert. A rehearsed performance. Was it, Wallace? Jenkins said, turning to face him. The Arabic script was flawless. The Korean proverb was contextually perfect. The calligraphy alone would be the work of a decade of practice. And the girl's grandfather, Michael Callahan. I read the declassified files on his unit for my research on Cold War intelligence. The man wasn't just a linguist, he was a prodigy. It seems he passed it on. Jenkins gestured toward the board. You asked her to write something in Japanese to amuse the class. You wanted to make a point about how difficult and inaccessible knowledge is, how special people like us are for possessing it. He shook his head slowly. And she made a point of her own. That knowledge isn't a weapon for humiliating others. It's a legacy. It's a bridge. It's a story. Thorne had no reply. Jenkins's words were too true. He had always seen his intellect as a mark of superiority, a tool to establish his dominance. He collected languages the way a king collects jewels, to be displayed and admired, not to be used to connect with the common people. You underestimated her, Wallace, Jenkins said, his voice losing its mocking edge and taking on a note of pity. You looked at her mother's uniform and her simple dress, and you decided who she was before she ever picked up the chalk. That was your first mistake. Your second was giving her the chalk. With that, Jenkins turned and walked away, leaving Thorne alone with his thoughts and the damning evidence of his folly. Meanwhile, in the grand, sunlit corridor outside the auditorium, Dr. Richmond was speaking with Helen and Abigail. Her initial excitement had settled into a calm, focused determination. The Young Scholars Program is designed for university-level students, of course, she was explaining. But the charter allows for extraordinary exceptions. I think we can all agree that you qualify, Abigail. Helen was overwhelmed. A university program? But she hasn't even finished high school. We couldn't possibly afford. Helen, Dr. Richmond said gently, placing a hand on her arm. We are not talking about tuition. We are talking about a full scholarship. Stipends for books, housing, everything. The university would be gaining far more than it would be giving. A mind like your daughter's comes along once in a generation. Abigail was quiet, listening to the 2 women discuss her future as if it were a settled fact. Part of her felt a dizzying sense of hope. All those nights spent reading by a small lamp, devouring her grandfather's books, exploring worlds through their vocabularies and grammars. She had never imagined it could lead to this. It had always been a private world, a secret garden she shared only with his memory. But another part of her felt a pang of sadness. It was all happening so fast. Her grandfather had taught her about the world, but he had also taught her to be wary of it. He had seen how institutions, armies, governments, even universities, could try to own a person's gift to turn it into a tool for their own purposes. What would I have to do? Abigail asked, her first question about the practicalities of this new path. Dr. Richmond smiled, impressed by the girl's composure. You would study, of course, with mentors of your choosing. You would have access to the university's full resources, our libraries, our archives, our language labs. You would not be bound by a standard curriculum. Your education would be tailored to your abilities. In essence, we would be giving you the keys to the kingdom. And what does the kingdom want in return? Abigail asked, her blue eyes searching the professor's face. The question was so direct, so insightful, that it took Dr. Richmond by surprise. She paused before answering, choosing her words carefully. The university would, of course, hope that your work would one day reflect well upon it. Publications, research. But speaking for myself, she said, her voice softening, what I want is for you to have the chance your grandfather never did. The chance to use your gifts not in the shadows of war, but in the light of day. To build those bridges he spoke of. The answer seemed to satisfy Abigail. She nodded slowly. This was a purpose she could understand. Her mother, however, was still trying to grasp the new reality. All of this, from one morning? She whispered, looking from Dr. Richmond to her daughter. Sometimes, Dr. Richmond replied, her eyes twinkling. One morning is all it takes to change the world. Or at least, a small corner of it. Their conversation was interrupted by a tentative voice. Miss Callahan? They turned to see the graduate student from the front row, the one who had studied in Kyoto. He was a young man with earnest eyes and a stack of books clutched to his chest. Several other students hovered behind him. We just wanted to say, he stammered, that what you did in there was incredible. The calligraphy, the way you linked the proverbs. It was humbling. Another student, a young woman, stepped forward. Professor Thorne, he can be difficult. We're sorry you were treated that way. Abigail looked at them, at their sincere, respectful faces. These were the scholars her grandfather had told her about. The ones who were driven by a genuine love of learning, not by ego. Thank you, she said, a real, warm smile finally reaching her eyes. He just made a mistake. It was more than a mistake, the young man insisted. He was cruel. But you weren't. You could have destroyed him. You could have chosen a phrase that was insulting or aggressive. But you chose grace. You chose philosophy. That was the most impressive part. Abigail simply nodded, accepting the compliment. In her mind, she heard her grandfather's voice again. There's no victory in humiliation, Abby girl. The best way to win an argument is to make the other person see a bigger truth. As the students began to ask her questions about the scripts, about her grandfather, about her methods, Abigail found herself talking, explaining, sharing the knowledge that had been her private sanctuary for so long. She was no longer just the maid's daughter. She was a teacher. She was a scholar. She was her grandfather's living legacy. Helen stood back, watching her daughter hold court with students twice her age. She saw the confidence, the quiet authority, the brilliant light that shone from within her. The little girl who used to hide behind her skirts was gone. In her place stood a young woman who could command a room with nothing more than her mind and her integrity. The morning was not yet over. The bells on the clock tower had not yet chimed for noon. But in the hushed, sun-drenched corridor of the linguistics building, a new world was being born, one word at a time. The small group of students dispersed as Dr. Richmond gently guided Abigail and Helen away from the auditorium's entrance and down a wide, marble-floored hallway. The air here was different, cooler and quieter. Portraits of stern-faced university presidents from centuries past watched them from the walls, their gazes seeming to follow the unlikely trio, the esteemed professor, the woman in the maid's uniform, and the girl with the universe of words behind her eyes. The dean's office is this way, Dr. Richmond said, her voice a reassuring presence in the echoing hall. Dean Morrison needs to hear about this immediately. What happened in that room? It was more than an academic event. Helen was still trying to process the whiplash of the last hour. She had walked into that building fearing they might be scolded for interrupting, and now she was walking alongside the head of a department toward the office of the most powerful person at the university. She clutched her handbag, the one Abigail had been holding for her, as if it were an anchor in a suddenly turbulent sea. She looked at her daughter, who walked with a quiet poise that Helen had never seen before. It was the same poise her father, Michael, had possessed, a stillness that suggested a deep and unshakable core. "Dr. Richmond," Helen began, her voice barely a whisper, "are you sure about this? We don't want to cause any trouble." Abigail didn't mean to cause trouble. Dr. Richmond stopped and turned to face her, her expression one of profound sincerity. "My dear Helen, your daughter didn't cause trouble." She revealed a truth. Universities are supposed to be places where truths are revealed, not hidden. You have nothing to apologize for. She then looked at Abigail. "And neither do you. Never let anyone make you feel that your gift is a form of disruption." Abigail nodded, appreciating the woman's fierce protectiveness. It was a stark contrast to Professor Thorne's dismissiveness. Dr. Richmond saw her gift as something to be nurtured. Professor Thorne had seen it as something to be mocked. They arrived at a set of imposing oak doors with a simple brass plaque that read, "Office of the Dean." Dr. Richmond knocked once before pushing the door open and ushering them inside. The office was vast and flooded with light from a floor-to-ceiling bay window that overlooked the university's main quad. The walls were lined with books, not the well-worn paperbacks of Abigail's home, but leather-bound volumes that looked as old as the university itself. A large mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, behind which sat a man with a kind, weary face and a head of thinning gray hair. This was Dean Morrison. He stood up as they entered, his eyes immediately finding Abigail. He had clearly already received a message, as his expression was one of curiosity and anticipation rather than surprise. "Eleanor," he said, his voice warm. "Thank you for coming straight here." His gaze shifted to Helen and Abigail. "And you must be Mrs. Callahan and Abigail. Please, sit down." He gestured to two plush leather chairs that faced his desk. For Helen, sinking into the soft leather felt like entering another world. She sat on the very edge of the cushion, her back ramrod straight. Abigail sat calmly, her hands folded in her lap, observing the dean with the same quiet intensity with which she had observed the lecture hall. "I received a rather breathless email from one of your graduate students, Eleanor," the dean began, a faint smile playing on his lips. It contained a photograph of a chalkboard and a series of superlatives I haven't seen since the football team won the championship in '98. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, all traces of humor gone. He said a young girl had just given the most profound linguistics lesson he had ever witnessed. "I take it you were that young girl." Abigail was a guest in Professor Thorne's lecture, Dr. Richmond explained, taking the other chair. She quickly recounted the morning's events, from Thorne's condescending invitation to Abigail's stunning, multilingual response. She did not embellish or editorialize. The facts themselves were powerful enough. As she spoke, Dean Morrison listened intently. His eyes never left Abigail's face. He was not just hearing the story. He was trying to read the person at the center of it. He saw no arrogance, no childish pride. He saw a deep, settled intelligence. He saw an old soul. When Dr. Richmond finished, the room was silent for a moment. "Incredible," the dean murmured, shaking his head in wonder. "Her grandfather was Michael Callahan, you said?" "Yes," Helen confirmed, finding her voice. "My father. I knew of him," the dean said, a note of reverence in his tone. "The university archives have a small, mostly classified file on his wartime work. We tried to award him an honorary doctorate a decade ago. He politely declined. He said, and I quote, 'The only letters I care about are the ones that make up words, not the ones that come after my name.'" A tear trickled down Helen's cheek, and she quickly wiped it away. That was her father, to the letter. A man of profound substance who cared nothing for status. There was a sharp knock on the door. The dean's secretary opened it and announced, "Professor Thorne is here, sir." "Send him in," the dean said, his voice hardening slightly. Professor Wallace Thorne entered the room. If he had looked deflated in the lecture hall, he looked utterly broken now. His face was ashen, his impeccable posture had crumbled, and he clutched a briefcase to his chest like a shield. His eyes darted around the room, landing on Abigail. He flinched, as if he had seen a ghost. "Wallace," the dean began, his tone formal and cold. "Please, close the door." Thorne did as he was told. He stood awkwardly by the door, a stark contrast to the confident man who had commanded the stage an hour ago. "I have been made aware of an incident that occurred during your guest lecture this morning," Dean Morrison said, his voice low and dangerous. "An incident involving a guest on our campus. A minor." Thorne swallowed hard. "Charles, it was a misunderstanding. A pedagogical exercise that was misinterpreted." "A pedagogical exercise?" the dean repeated, his voice laced with ice. "My understanding is that you singled out a 14-year-old girl, the daughter of a member of our staff, and invited her on stage with the clear intention of using her presumed ignorance to amuse your students. Is that an accurate summary?" Thorne could not meet his gaze. "It was ill-judged," he mumbled. "It was cruel, Wallace," the dean snapped, his voice rising. "It was an abuse of your position. It was a violation of the most basic principles of decency and respect that this university is supposed to represent. And to make matters worse, your intended victim turned out to be a prodigy whose knowledge in your own field may very well exceed your own." The final sentence hung in the air, a perfectly delivered coup de grace. Thorne had no defense. He had been exposed not just as a bully, but as an inferior scholar in the presence of true, profound talent. "I want you to apologize," the dean commanded, to both Abigail and her mother. Now, it was the ultimate humiliation for a man like Wallace Thorne. He shuffled forward, his expensive shoes silent on the thick carpet. He stood before Abigail and Helen, unable to look them in the eye. I apologize," he stammered, his words tasting like ash in his mouth. "My conduct was inappropriate." It was a hollow, forced apology, and everyone in the room knew it. But Abigail simply nodded. She did not need his remorse. Her victory had never been about him. It had been about honoring her grandfather. "Thank you, Professor," she said, her voice clear and steady, devoid of sarcasm or triumph. The simple, dignified acceptance was, in its own way, more damning than any angry retort could have been. It placed her on a different plane entirely, one he could never hope to reach. "You can go now, Wallace," the dean said, his voice a clear dismissal. "We will discuss the future of your guest lectureship later. I suggest you take the rest of the day to reflect on the difference between education and arrogance." Without another word, Thorne turned and fled the office, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him, sealing his disgrace. The tension in the room dissipated instantly. Dean Morrison let out a long breath and turned his attention back to Abigail, his expression softening once more. "Now," he said, a genuine smile returning to his face, "let's talk about your future. Dr. Richmond has recommended you for immediate admission into the Young Scholars Program. As you may have heard, this is unprecedented. But your situation is, to put it mildly, unprecedented." He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a folder. "This program comes with a full, 4-year scholarship covering all tuition and fees. It includes a stipend for living expenses, a book allowance, and on-campus housing, should you want it. You would be assigned a primary mentor. I suspect Dr. Richmond would be first in line for that honor. And you would be free to audit any class in this university, at any level, while we design a personalized curriculum for you." Helen gasped. It was more than she had ever dared to dream of for her daughter. It was a golden ticket, a key to a world she had only ever been able to clean and serve. The years of scrimping and saving, of working until her bones ached, had suddenly been rendered unnecessary by her daughter's brilliant mind. The relief was so overwhelming that she began to cry, silent tears of joy and gratitude streaming down her face. Abigail reached over and took her mother's hand. She looked at the dean, her expression serious. "My grandfather always said that a gift isn't what you have, it's what you do with it," she said. "What would the university expect me to do with this?" The dean leaned back in his chair, deeply impressed once again by her maturity. "That's the best question I've been asked all year, Abigail," he said. "What we would expect is for you to learn, to grow, to follow your curiosity wherever it leads. We would expect you to challenge your professors, to push the boundaries of our knowledge, and to share what you discover with the world. We are not offering you a job. We are offering you an opportunity. What you do with it will ultimately be up to you." He slid the folder across the desk. There is paperwork, of course. Forms to be filled out. But in essence, Abigail Callahan, Westwood University would be honored to welcome you as its youngest ever scholar. The place is yours, if you want it. Abigail looked at the folder, then at her crying mother, then at the encouraging smile on Dr. Richmond's face. The path of her life had just forked in a dramatic and irreversible way. The quiet, book-filled life she had known was over. A new, much larger life was beginning. "I accept," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Thank you." The walk from the dean's office back across the manicured lawns of the campus was surreal. The mid-morning sun was warm on their faces. Students lounged on the grass with books, their chatter and laughter a gentle hum in the air. Just an hour ago, this world had seemed impossibly distant, a place where Abigail and her mother were invisible service workers on the periphery. Now, it was to be Abigail's world. Helen walked in a daze, the folder with the scholarship papers clutched in her hand like a holy text. She kept opening it and rereading the first page, as if to convince herself it was real. "A full scholarship," she murmured for the 10th time. "Abby, do you understand what this means? You'll never have to worry. You can just learn." "I know, Mom," Abigail said softly, slipping her arm through her mother's. She could feel the tremors of emotion running through her. They stopped beneath the shade of a large oak tree near the edge of campus. The imposing stone buildings of the university were behind them now, and the familiar, bustling streets of the town were ahead. It felt like standing on a border between two countries. "Your grandfather would be so proud," Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. "He always knew. He always said you had a special mind." She looked at her daughter, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "I remember when you were 6. He was trying to teach you cat and dog, and you were getting bored. You pointed to one of his old books, one he'd brought back from his travels, and you asked him what the strange writing was." Abigail smiled, the memory surfacing. "It was the copy of the Mahabharata," she said. "That's the one," Helen confirmed. "Written in that beautiful, complicated script. He told you it was called Devanagari, and the language was Sanskrit. He explained that it was very old and very difficult. He thought that would be the end of it." Helen let out a small, wet laugh. "The next morning, he came into the living room, and you were sitting on the floor with a crayon and a piece of paper. You had copied the first character from the book's cover. It was wobbly, and the proportions were all wrong, but it was perfect. He knelt down beside you and asked what you had drawn." Helen's eyes met her daughter's. "Do you remember what you told him?" Abigail nodded. "I told him, it's a letter. It wants to say something, but I don't know its name yet." "That's right," Helen whispered, her hand tightening on Abigail's arm. "That's when he knew. He looked at me, and his eyes were so full of wonder. He said, 'Helen, she doesn't just see shapes. She hears the music in them.' From that day on, he never taught you like a child again. He taught you like a fellow traveler, a fellow explorer of words." They stood in silence for a moment, enveloped by the memory of the man who had shaped both their lives. He was gone, but his legacy was so powerfully alive in that moment that it felt as if he were standing there with them, a proud and loving ghost under the old oak tree. "I'm scared, Abby," Helen confessed, her voice dropping to a whisper. "This is such a big world. These people, they're not like us." "They're just people, Mom," Abigail replied, her own voice steady, a comforting anchor. "Some are like Professor Thorne. Some are like Dr. Richmond. We just have to learn to tell the difference. Grandfather taught me how." "How?" "You listen," Abigail said simply. "You listen not just to what they say, but to the words they don't use. You look at their grammar. People who use a lot of commands and declarations, they think they own the world. People who ask questions, they're the ones who are still learning. I'll stick with the learners." Helen looked at her 14-year-old daughter and felt a wave of awe. When had she become so wise? She had been so busy working to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table that she had failed to see the incredible woman her daughter was already becoming. "Come on," Abigail said, giving her mother's arm a gentle tug. "Let's go home. I think we've had enough excitement for one morning." As they stepped off the curb and left the university grounds behind, it felt less like a departure and more like a promise. A promise that they would be back, not as servants, but as equals. The Callahan family was returning to the world, and this time, they would not be invisible. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a modest brick building that had seen better days. But inside, It was a sanctuary. It was small and filled with secondhand furniture, but it was meticulously clean and orderly. And everywhere, there were books. They were stacked on shelves, piled on end tables, and overflowing from wicker baskets. They were the one luxury Helen allowed, the one thing she and Abigail both treasured. They were Michael Callahan's legacy, a library of the world crammed into 2 small rooms. The moment they walked through the door, the weight of the morning seemed to shift. The grandeur of the dean's office and the tension of the lecture hall melted away, replaced by the comforting familiarity of home. Helen went to the small kitchen to put the kettle on, a ritual that grounded her. "Tea," she announced, her voice already sounding more like her usual self. "Everything is better after a cup of tea." Abigail walked into her room. It was little more than a closet with a window, dominated by a small bed, a simple wooden desk, and bookshelves that covered every inch of available wall space, built by her grandfather's own hands. This was her true home, the heart of her world. Here, she was surrounded by her oldest and dearest friends. Homer, in the original Greek, Cervantes, in Spanish, Tolstoy, in Russian, the poetry of Li Bai, in Chinese. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, the familiar textures of comfort. Her gaze fell upon the worn, blue cloth cover of the Mahabharata. She pulled it from the shelf. Its pages were soft and thin, and the air smelled of old paper and sandalwood incense. She carried it to her desk and sat down. On the corner of the desk was a framed, black and white photograph of a young man in a soldier's uniform, his eyes kind and intelligent, a ghost of a smile on his face. Her grandfather. Abigail placed the scholarship papers from the dean's office next to the photograph. The crisp, official documents looked out of place in this room of ancient stories and quiet study. She opened the ancient epic poem. Her grandfather had told her that Sanskrit was the language of the universe's vibrations, a perfect language where sound and meaning were intrinsically linked. He had only begun to teach it to her in the last year of his life, and she had continued to study it on her own, feeling it was her most direct connection to him. It was more than a language. It was a form of meditation. She picked up a pen and a blank notebook. She didn't think about Professor Thorne or Dean Morrison or the life-changing offer she had just accepted. She cleared her mind, just as her grandfather had taught her to do. She focused only on the present moment, on the feel of the pen in her hand, the texture of the paper, the sound of the kettle beginning to whistle in the other room. Then, she began to write. She wasn't copying from the book. She was forming the letters from memory, letting them flow onto the page. The Devanagari script was a thing of beauty, with its strong horizontal line from which the characters hung like intricate jewels. She wrote a single word, Shani, peace, then another, Jnana, knowledge, and a final one, Dharma, one's true purpose, the right way of living. Peace, knowledge, purpose. This was the language her grandfather had saved for last. He said that after she had learned to speak to the world in all its modern tongues, she needed to learn the language that spoke to the soul. As she wrote, the turmoil of the morning finally settled within her. The humiliation she had felt on her mother's behalf, the shock of the confrontation, the dizzying prospect of her new future, it all coalesced into a single, clear feeling, gratitude. She was grateful for the arrogant professor, because without his cruelty, her gift might have remained hidden. She was grateful for Dr. Richmond and the dean, for they had seen her and not a caricature. Most of all, she was grateful for the quiet man in the photograph, who had given her not just languages, but a philosophy for living. He had armed her for a battle she hadn't even known she would have to fight. Helen appeared in the doorway, holding 2 steaming mugs of tea. She didn't speak, just stood and watched her daughter for a moment. She saw the intense focus, the graceful movement of her hand, the way she seemed to be in a world of her own. The Sanskrit was the one language Helen didn't recognize, the one that felt the most sacred and mysterious. It was the final, private conversation between her daughter and her father. She walked in and placed a mug on the desk. "What are you writing?" she asked softly. Abigail looked up from her notebook, her blue eyes calm and clear. "I'm just reminding myself of the things that matter." She slid the notebook toward her mother. Helen looked at the 3 beautiful, alien words. Peace, Abigail translated. Knowledge, and purpose. Helen put her hand on her daughter's shoulder, her heart full. This was the result of Michael Callahan's life's work. Not just a granddaughter who could speak 9 languages, but one who understood the meaning behind the words. From outside, the sound of the university's clock tower began to chime, the deep, resonant bells marking the hour. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 12. Noon. The morning was over. Abigail looked from her notebook to the official papers, and finally to her grandfather's smiling face. A new journey was about to begin, a path paved with the words of the entire world. And she was ready to walk it. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.